Friday the 13th, a movie series that's drilled into the heads of children and teenagers all over the world that intercourse equals death far better than any religious organization ever has. And Friday the 13th, a movie series that's had more entries than meaningful relationships I've ever had, that spans over 10 movies involving hell, space, a crossover, and a reboot. In other words, someone found the print money button, but long before the iconic hockey mask was introduced, and Freddy and Jason battled it out accompanied by the most 2000s metal you could possibly think of, things started out a little closer to reality. Friday the 13th would come to be after Sean Cunningham and fellow horror legend Wes Craven would create the early 70s brutally shocking movie The Last House on the Left. A movie that involved some not very nice people doing some not very nice things. It was a pretty big success, and soon thereafter, Sean became known as the guy who made disturbing horror movies, but cheaply. And no, not your parents' sex tape kind of cheap horror, something else. Whereas Wes would go on to create a different fleshy ballbag looking character a few years later, the seed that would go on to create this fleshy ballbag looking character would be planted after Sean watched John Carpenter's 1978 Halloween and said, yeah, I could do that. Victor Miller, Friday screenwriter, would then go and watch Halloween only once, and basically reverse engineer its formula to essentially create the guidebook that many horror slashers would follow during the 80s horror boom. For starters, there needs to be an established prior evil. There needs to be a group of adolescents who aren't able to get any help from adults. And if you make premarital love, the big bad boogeyman is going to spill your insides all over the outsides, and leave a rather unfortunate teenage-sized mess for somebody to clean up later. The year is 1957 at Camp Crystal Lake, and a little boy named Jason decides to go and take an unsupervised swim in the lake, despite quite literally having the same amount of buoyancy as an average sack of bricks, resulting in him taking a permanent bath. He was supposed to be supervised by camp counselors Claudette and Barry, but on account of them being a little bit too busy, with Barry vigorously inspecting Claudette's insides with his pecker, Jason would then go on to develop quite the post-horrifically drowning love-hate relationship with people bumping uglies. And by love, I mean Jason would absolutely love to catch you doing it, resulting in the only thing you'll be doing prematurely is dying. A year after the accident, a series of murders would take place on the grounds, followed by strange fires and just general bad vibes all around, resulting in Camp Crystal Lake remaining closed right up until 1980 as Steve Christie, the son of the original owners, decides to get it back into shape for a reopening. And shortly after, the new camp counselors would arrive to help prepare for the opening, in something that I'm sure wasn't in the fine print of their employment contracts. They'd be prepared for the afterlife as one by one, they're brutally and horrifically butchered on Jason's birthday, because nothing gets you into the birthday spirit quite like massacring a bunch of teenagers. In what was a pretty shocking twist for back then, the killer would later be revealed to be Pamela Voorhees, Jason's mother, an apparent secret bodybuilder, as she's able to launch chicks through windows. Understandably, she's not exactly happy with the little event known as her only child drowning to death, and unfortunately has gone off the deep end because of it. A bit like Jason, doing anything in her power to assure that Camp Crystal Lake remains closed. And if that means killing a bunch of horny teenagers in the process, then so be it. Pamela is ultimately killed by the final girl Alice, because this is a slasher movie, of course there's going to be a final girl, and that's where this once originally intended to be standalone movie was actually supposed to end. Sean Cunningham would say in an episode of The Movies That Made Us, the script ended in a kind of traditional way, where the heroine has finally become victorious. But the plan would ultimately change, as the movie's financial backer suggested that a Carrie-like ending would give the viewers one final scare. And that's when we get the dream sequence of juvenile delinquent drowning victim committing a water-based murder. But as we all know, she then goes on to wake up in the safety of a hospital bed, gets an injection in the butt, and then the movie ends. Because a sequel equals money, and man in suit likes money, cocaine expensive. So with all that being said, let's get into the meat and potatoes of the video, shall we? Or should I say, an angry grandma getting into horny teenagers by poking their fleshy bits with sharp objects of the video, and count down the kills from the original Friday the 13th, from worst to best. Starting us off with the worst kill, in the 9th spot, we have Ned. Ned's the generic goofball, comedy relief character that would appear a dime a dozen in horror movies of the time. He's the type of guy that wasn't particularly close with anyone, but always did things to divert attention towards him, which would explain why he seemed to be a little bit bummed out to witness Jack and Marcie inspecting each other's tonsils with their tongues, more than likely wishing that he had a connection like that. He's about to receive a connection of sorts, the connection from one part of his throat forcibly removed from the other. Ned hears a noise and notices someone lurking around a nearby cabin, so decides to go and investigate. And we don't see until later, when Jack and Marcie are making sure each other's sexual organs still work, you know, like scientific reasons and stuff, that Ned is laying in the bed above them, not being a dirty perv, but in fact being very dead with his throat cut open. I get what it's doing. It's trying to let the viewers know that there's some kind of mysterious entity with a serious hate boner roaming around these here woods. But it kinda already demonstrated that to us with Annie. So yeah, sorry Ned, your death is the worst. Up next, we're travelling back in time from the 1980s to the 1950s without the use of a DeLorean. We're witnessing the first ever murders that occurred at Camp Crystal Lake, Claudette and Barry. And I know that these are two different characters, so technically two different kills, but as these are the two characters responsible for Jason's drowning, essentially kicking off the entire reason behind the series in the process, and the fact that they both die in the same scene together, I'm gonna group them up. Back in 1958, 1 year after Jason's drowning, not only are the two people responsible for the death of a child still working in a camp full of children, but they're about to do the exact same thing again that resulted in his death a year ago. They must really like dead kids. While singing songs around the fireplace, and after getting bored of intensely eye-f***ing each other, Claudette and Barry quickly upgrade to really f*** each other out of view and away from prying eyes. But it's not the prying eyes that they should be worrying about. More like the prying knife that's making its way deep into their internal organs, as that's exactly what happens to Barry, kinda putting a whole damper on the whole having sex thing. Before then, poor old Claudette is subjected to the absolutely unthinkable horror known as becoming a freeze frame that zooms directly into her face. I honestly couldn't think of anything worse. It's not exactly the most interesting death in a slasher movie. At least you actually get to see this one, unlike poor old Ned with an extra breathing hole in his neck. But it's important, as these two characters are the entire reason behind Mrs. Voorhees' psychotic rampage through the first movie, which in turn kickstarted the rest. All 92 of them, or however many of them there are at this point. Next on the ranking is Steve. Steve is the type of guy to love a good old child drowning, so decides to once again get the park back up and running. He serves as somewhat of an authority figure for the counselors, so much in fact, that he just kind of wanders off and leaves them to get brutally massacred by a grandma. After his car breaks down in the middle of a storm on the way back to the camp, Steve walks his way back up and is approached by someone as they're pointing a flashlight directly into his face. For a split second, he seems to actually recognize the person attempting to burn out his retinas, but fails to recognize the pointy death stick they're holding as they plant it firmly into his chest. The scene cuts away there and doesn't give you a definitive answer on what happened to Steve, but he's later discovered by a terrified Alice as she comes across him hanging upside down with a knife wound to the torso, because apparently the last thing Steve thought to do before bleeding to death was to dangle upside down like a monkey. Poor old Steve, all he wanted was for some more kids to drown. For a second there, the movie tricks you into thinking that all you're going to get out of Steve's death is his recreation of my face every time I stub my toe in the middle of the night. But it redeems itself with the post-mortem upside down monkey bar swing. Next up is Brenda, meeting her rather untimely demise after a rather intense night of vigorous strip Monopoly, leading me to think that I've been playing this family board game wrong my entire life. I usually start the game naked. After heading back to her cabin for the night, she hears the distant sound of a female voice in the storm calling out for help. In other words, a mind your own business and pretend you never heard anything scenario. But instead of doing that, Brenda decides to head out into the storm and follow the creepy cries for help, because apparently she doesn't like keeping her limbs attached to her body. After Brenda makes it to the archery range, she's suddenly blinded as the floodlights come on before letting out a blood-curdling scream as it then cuts away to a different scene, because apparently Brenda really doesn't like archery. And that's the last we see or hear from Brenda for a while. Well, that is until she's quite literally thrown through a window by a pensioner, because Miss Voorhees takes crack for pre-workout. She's thrown at Alice through a window with a rope wrapped around her, her face slashed, and what looks to be a stab wound to the chest. The suspense and shock is really what gets you here. It comes right after Alice has just barricaded herself into one of the cabins, as she's just spent the last few minutes frantically trying to do whatever she can to keep whatever is after her out there, even if that means barricading a door that opens in the opposite direction. But okay. For the fifth spot on the list, we've got Annie, the camp counselor who never made it to the camp. Well, never made it alive at least. Annie's hitchhiking her way up to Camp Crystal Lake. Right after, the movie skips ahead from 1958 to what it calls the present, aka 40-something years ago. After getting a ride some other way, she gets picked up by a car that I'm pretty sure is the exact same one that Steve drives and is driven right past the turning for the camp. And after the driver refuses to pull over, Annie decides that her best option is to dive out of a speeding vehicle and do a front flip into a ditch for some reason, but not before she puts a pad on her left arm, of course. She wouldn't want to hurt herself trying to get away from a psychotic killer. After limping away into the woods, she's cut off by Mrs. Voorhees before having something else cut off by Mrs. Voorhees, her throat. If only she had one of those pads to put on her neck. Counting down to the number 4 spot, we've got Marcie. After Ned watched on as Jack and Marcie proceeded to get rather intimate with each other's esophaguses, Jack takes Marcie back to their cabin to give her a little tickle from the inside, all the while Ned is above them, finally able to get in on a little bit of the action he's been craving, but unfortunately is a little too, well, dead to enjoy it. Once they're done, Marcie leaves the cabin to use the restroom and get all of the Kevin Bacon residue out of her, but as she's there, multiple times she hears what she thinks is someone else in there with her, but after getting no response, brushes it off as nothing and proceeds to do movie impressions in front of the mirror as if there isn't a psychotic murderous grandma lurking in the shadows somewhere. She once again goes to investigate a strange sound, but the only thing that she ends up finding is a hatchet planted firmly into her skull. Not only is this the second instance of if you have sex then you're gonna get sliced up, but it's also an instance of using tension well in a scene that puts you on edge. You know it's coming. The second Marcie entered that bathroom, she wouldn't be leaving without something protruding from one of her vital organs. But it's the way it pulls you along just a little bit further until eventually, man, she dead. Next we've got Bill. I haven't really got much to say about Bill's character really, other than the fact that he just kind of exists until Miss Voorhees makes him not exist. As what would come to be the norm with the slasher genre, the majority of characters are empty vessels, with their only true purpose being to be sprayed in the face with blood, do a weird little death face, and try really hard not to breathe as the camera focuses on them being dead. So it's not really much of a surprise that I don't really find the actual character of Bill to be all that memorable, without knowing the true extent of what has been transpiring through the night. After the power goes out, Bill decides to head out alone to check on the generator, and after dipping a stick into the fuel supply to see if it's empty, he very quickly finds a stick thrust into him to make his life empty. It's not exactly clear what actually happens to Bill at first, that is right up until Alice stumbles across his corpse stuck up on the outside of a door, with his throat cut open, an arrow in his eye, neck, torso and groin. This pretty brutal act shows that Miss Voorhees clearly isn't just killing them to get the job done and to assure that the camp won't reopen. She's obviously getting some kind of sadistic pleasure from it. Okay, you cut his throat open, he's dead now. But then you proceed to somehow lift up a grown man, stick him to a door somehow, and repeatedly fire arrows into him, with one even shot into his little Bill. Let's just hope that the throat slicing came before he received the unusually large penis piercing. At the number 2 spot, we've got Jack. And with the spot comes arguably one of the best kills in the movie, as well as a funny story to go along with it that just proves how dedicated to their craft the people who worked on this movie were. After Marcie leaves Jack for an impromptu lobotomy in the toilets, Jack lights up a joint before being given a reminder from above that smoking kills. And by up above, I mean Ned, who's lying dead on the bunk above him, dripping blood all over his face. Suddenly, someone grabs his head from beneath the bed and forces an arrow through the back of his neck, giving him an extra non-consensual breathing hole in the process. That bacon's a little well done. We've seen a lot of suspense used for the killing throughout the movie so far, and rightly so, they use it well, but Jack's kill catches you completely by surprise. One minute he's taking a puff, and the next he's Mrs. Voorhees' latest pincushion. In the modern day HD releases of the film, you can clearly see the fake neck that very obviously doesn't belong to Kevin Bacon, but I'm sure that's just a byproduct of the quality increase of displays over the years. If you were watching this on your old tube TV, on a VHS of questionable quality, as you stayed up late past your bedtime giving yourself summer camp related PTSD, then it more than likely just wouldn't have been a problem. But what makes the shot even more impressive is that it could only be shot once, and that it almost went horribly wrong. But thanks to practical effects legend Tom Savini, who handled the gore and makeup for the movie, he made sure that they still got their shot. Tom was under the bed, not getting frisky with Mrs. Voorhees, but operating a pump that would push the blood through a pipe and out of Kevin Bacon's fake neck. But as the shot was underway, the device malfunctioned, so Tom, thinking quickly, decided to use his mouth to push the real sheep's blood through the device, which saved the shot that they could only shoot once, but in the process absolutely drenched Tom in the blood, making him look like the type of guy who isn't afraid to love his girl any day of the month. So the number 1 kill from the original Friday the 13th goes to Pamela Voorhees. After Alice channels her inner Tom and Jerry and knocks Pamela unconscious with a frying pan, committing elderly abuse in the process, Pamela sneaks up behind her with a machete, and despite being able to quite literally kill everybody else with ease, ends up in a struggle with Alice, where the final girl ultimately manages to get a hold of the machete, making Pamela a few pounds lighter in the process as she relieves her of her head. And as her hands come up to clutch the air, if you look closely, you can actually see they're not the hands of Pamela's actor Betsy Palmer, but the hairy hands of practical effects legend Tom Savini, who's actually credited on the IMDb page as Killer's Hands. And I did have to battle with myself whether I was going to put Jack's kill at number 1 or Pamela's kill, but come on, it's a decapitation. And the funny thing is about Betsy Palmer's inclusion in the movie is that she thought it was absolutely awful, nobody would see it, and that it'd be a quick way to make a bit of cash to replace her broken down car, with an actual quote from her being, "What a piece of shit, nobody is ever gonna see this thing." Well, I watched it, Betty, so take that. Even after all of those kills that leave you questioning, could an old lady really be capable of such a thing, the original Friday the 13th doesn't include the grown-up, unstoppable force that is Jason. It includes the small, very stoppable by a little bit of water Jason, who is supposedly very much dead and a victim in this story, which just makes the second movie that came out the next year just a little bit confusing, as there's a fully grown Jason walking around and unaliving people with a potato sack on his head. But hey, potato potato. A kill I very much would have liked to include is Alice being dragged into the lake by a soggy baby Jason, but unfortunately it doesn't count as it's just a dream sequence. Or is it? No, I mean, seriously, someone please tell me, how the hell is he alive in the next movie? But if it did count, it would have ranked pretty well. But anyway, with all of the kills ranked, let me know your personal Friday the 13th kill list from worst to best. Do you agree with mine? Let me know in a comment. Or don't, if you just want to be rude, I guess. If you've liked the first episode of this new series, consider showing your support by giving it a like, or maybe leave a suggestion or two about any other movies or franchises that you'd like to see covered like this. And going forward from today, patrons will receive uncensored versions of all ranking and brutality of videos, some behind the scenes content as well, and exclusive access to the Patreon only Discord. So a big thank you to everyone to making it to the end, and another big thank you to all of the channel supporters over on Patreon, which are Dom, Hunters263, Rebecca Pitts, A Dandy in Space, Martin Brannan, Natasha Twyman, Jared C. Bees, Pascal Mathis, Fighting the Pirates, Richard McGowan III, Macy J, Reese Harford, Chris, Michelle, Dennis, Wade Knott, Ashley L. Wintz, Christopher Butsky, Joshua Torres, Remy, Josh Brooks, Dyreme, Robert Zerweck, Dark Shiva, Josh Hannon, Billy Whitaker, Kadav Lopez, Lonif, Jay Slows, Daniel Dickinson, and Donnie Do Work. Thank you all so much for your support, and thank you to everyone else for watching.